Right. Okay. I think we'll just it's just back at 12 o'clock now, so I think we'll just get started. So, thank you very much for joining us today on a wonderful Wednesday from sunny Aberdeen today. Once again, we're in the virtual world, so it looks like certainly for the foreseeable future, this will be the way forward for these. So today we have a presentation from Alex Thatcher of OPC on multi-well deconvolution for field startups in the North Sea. So I'll get to that and give you a bit of an intro to Alex in a second. Just to kind of, this is my screen is closed. So a couple of points of order today. Once again, your microphones are muted and you won't be seen on video during the webinar. We will hold a live Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you can see the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, depending on how you're accessing Zoom, whether it's on a PC or an iPad or a phone, whatever sort of thing. So you can send questions anytime, but these will only be asked at the end of the presentation. So although there will be an opportunity to contact Alex, obviously out with this if you want to. There's a chat function that will be monitored during the presentation. But please note that the chat function is open and visible to all attendees. So a couple of upcoming events that we have, which is worth noting. So we have the Carbon Capture Conference, which will be running the week commencing the 26th of October. That's going to be a sort of virtual event with events taking place over the course of the week from Monday through to Thursday. So you can register for that. Don't click on your screen now where it says download here, but if you go onto the SPE website, you'll find more information on that. A couple of other events. We have Topsides, which is running again virtually on the 9th to the 13th of November, and UALF, which again has just changed its date now. So the UALF one is going to be in February 2021, and the digital program for that will be available soon. And again, just keep an eye out for the SPE website for sort of future events for the Wednesday webinars. There will be some young people events, young persons coming up very soon. So just keep an eye on the website addresses there. I think folk would probably be aware of it, so just keep checking that. And again, in these difficult times where everyone is working from home and not in the office, it's quite important to kind of, continue the conversations and connections online. We have our Facebook page, Twitter, LinkedIn, and also Instagram as well. So get in touch with us in any way, shape, or form these days. I've had some quite interesting ones from the Instagram page recently as well. So with reaching out to other sections across the world. So today we have welcome Alex Thatcher from OPC to do his talk on multi-well deconvolution. So we'll give you a quick bio of Alex. After graduating in petroleum engineering from Heriot-Watt, Alex joined the well test department at Schlumberger as a field engineer, mainly focused on the DST and TCP and data acquisition services in North Sea and in continental Europe. After a couple of years of Schlumberger, Alex then joined OPC as a reservoir engineer, focusing on pressure transient analysis and numerical simulation. Alex's most notable project to date was acting as a lead offshore reservoir engineer for the Zama appraisal project. And Zama is considered to be one of the world's largest shallow water oil discoveries in the last 20 years. And is also Mexico's first offshore block to be awarded to a private operator. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alex to get started.
Right, thanks, Terry. I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, welcome to my presentation. Yeah, my name's Alex Thatcher. I'm a reservoir engineer for OPC. If you don't know who OPC are, we are an oil and gas consultancy based in London, Aberdeen, and around the world. And we do a lot of pressure transient analysis. So my presentation today is on multi-well deconvolution for field startups. But before I get to that, I think I kind of need to give you a bit of a theoretical background into the history of PTA and why deconvolution was developed in the first place. So let's get started. So theoretical history of PTA. So in the 19th century, we had Darcy's law, that was flow in a porous medium. In the 1930s, we had water well drawdown analysis. Then in the 50s and 60s, we had build-up analysis, and they invented the Horner plot. And the Horner plot was a single constant rate drawdown followed by a build-up. And this allowed straight line analysis, generally by hand. In the 1970s, they came up with superposition theory, and that was to handle many flow periods at different flow rates with many build-ups. Then in the 80s, we had a big breakthrough in PTA. We had the advancement of gauges, computers, and software. And Dominic Bourdet invented the derivative type curve analysis. And the derivative really helped us identify flow regime signals and allowed much deeper analysis using PTA. In the 90s, they came up with numerical PEBI grids, and that was to handle more complex boundaries. In the 2000s, they came up with automatic pressure rate deconvolution on a single well basis. And that was mainly done by Imperial College and Levitan and Wilson. And Levitan and Wilson had the first deconvolution algorithm in the PTA software Pi. Now, Levitan found that deconvolution, automatic pressure rate deconvolution, was not a robust enough tool. So he's invented a new way to do deconvolution, and it's called manual reconstruction of the unit rate response function, PU. And it doesn't do deconvolution, it does convolution, and I'll explain all this later. But it can be done on a single well basis and a multi-well basis. And to validate all these results, he came up with a 2D analytical simulator. And this was really to remove PTA from boxes for analytical models. So let's get started. So PTA analysis in an ideal world. So I've created a channel reservoir, and at the moment it's got one well in it, well B1. You can see that it's in the middle between two parallel faults. It's closer to one boundary and further away than the other one. So remember, from the 1930s, constant rate drawdown was the starting point for all PTA, and the response perfectly traces out the reservoir. So what do I mean by a constant rate drawdown? So this is a producing well B1 at a constant rate, and in this case, it's flowing for 3,300 hours at this constant rate. And this is what the drawdown response would be. And by taking the derivative of this, we see all the flow regime signals. So let's start by tracing out this synthetic field. So in black, this is the pressure transient moving its way through the reservoir. And if we plot that on a derivative, we end up with radial flow. And on a derivative, that's characterized by a zero slope. And this is the derivative, and this is the dP curve. And the distance between the two curves characterizes the total skin of the well. So really what you're doing here is with radial flow, you're decoupling your KH from your skin. And the transient then propagates further out into the reservoir, and just before it hits the boundaries, we see a continuation of radial flow. But then at some point, bang, we hit those two parallel boundaries, and our flow geometry becomes linear flow. And that, on a Bourdet derivative, that's characterized by a half slope. And this flow regime continues until we see this closer boundary here, at which point the derivative starts to bend up off the half slope. And again, this continues until you see all boundaries in the reservoir, at which point you've reached pseudo steady state. And on a constant rate drawdown derivative, that's characterized by a unit slope in lake time. And that unit slope can be translated into the pore volume of the entire field. And from the pore volume, you can calculate the stock tank oil initially in place for this field. So let's do some straight line analysis on this Bourdet derivative. So radial flow, like I said, that calculates the permeability, and in this case, it's 500 millidarcies. The distance between the derivative to the dP curve, that characterizes the total skin, and in this case, it's plus 2.75. Analysis of the half slope, that tells us that our faults are 800 feet either way, or you could say the channeled width is 1,600 feet. We then find that this boundary down here is 3,000 feet away, and we find that the boundary far away is 8,000 feet away. And like I said, analysis of the unit slope in late time, you can calculate the connected pore volume to the well, and in this case, it's 4e to the 8 cubic feet. And then we can translate that into stock tank oil initially in place, and for this channel would be 34 million stock tank barrels. In reality, we never operate wells at a constant rate. We end up with the variable rate history, and this is what the pressure due to this variable rate history would be seen by your downhole pressure gauge. And you can see we end up with a few different constant rates, and we end up with a few PBUs. So in the 70s, they came up with superposition time, and superposition time was done to account for all these rate changes and we started analyzing single buildups. So you can see at the very end of my analysis period, I have a 300-hour PBU at the end. So again, back to the 70s, we ended up with superposition time to account for all these rate changes. So if we analyze this buildup, now the buildup starts here and ends here. This is the superposition plot. It's similar to the Horner plot. Remember, Horner was log TP plus delta T over delta T, but the Horner plot was limited to a constant rate followed by a PBU. And the superposition plot was extended, is an extension of the Horner plot, which accounts for all these rate changes. Now, if you're used to the Kappa Sapphire software, you might be used to seeing this plot going from left to right, but here it's going from right to left. And you can see you have the pressure of this PBU on the y-axis, but the x-axis is a calculation of superposition time, and you can see it's a summation of all these rates. So the derivative is calculated in superposition time. And if you take the derivative of this, you end up with this plot here. So pressure buildups were used as a proxy for constant rate drawdown theory, but it can cause complications in analysis. So let's compare this plot to the constant rate drawdown plot that you saw on the previous slide. So the title of this slide is Comparison of Variable Rate History to Constant Rate History. And I wanted to introduce the concept of connected volume while we're here. So what you see in pink is the constant rate drawdown theory in elapsed time. And what you see in blue is the build-up in superposition time. So let's work from left to right and talk about these two plots and make some comparisons. Well, we see radial flow is exactly the same and the wellbore storage is the same. So doing either method gives me the same results. So this is fine. And let me now introduce radius of investigation. So you can see radial flow ends about here, and calculation of that radius investigation results in a minimum connected volume of 4 million stock tank barrels of oil in place seen by radial flow. But if you try and apply the radius of investigation past radial flow, it's not really valid, it doesn't really work. So let's continue past radial flow. Well, in the constant rate drawdown theory, we clearly saw a half slope, but in the superposition plot, the flow regimes become distorted after radial flow. So it makes analysis tricky. You know, everyone's used to seeing a half slope. Am I really in a channel? Am I closer to one boundary than the other? It's not so clear in the build-up derivative, but it's very clear in the constant rate drawdown derivative. Another thing to mention is that, you know, build-ups cost us money. When we shut our wells in, we're not producing. And in this case, my build-up lasted 300 hours, which is a long time to have a well shut in for. But in the constant rate drawdown theory, I had an additional 3,300 hours of data, giving me much more insights into the reservoir. And finally, if the reservoir reaches pseudo-steady state, we see a clear unit slope in late time. Now, like I said, you can calculate the connected pore volume to the well, and this is the equation here for an oil reservoir. And from that pore volume, you can calculate the stock tank oil initially in place. And here we find out that, yes, it's 34 million stock tank barrels. And again, if we compare this to a build-up, you know, when a build-up derivative reaches pseudo-steady state, the pressure change becomes zero, and the derivative falls to zero. And there's no straight line analysis for this approach, so it does make it a bit more complex to calculate connected pore volumes. So let's make some conclusions. So a constant rate drawdown derivative, it adds more data to the derivative plot. It provides much better definition in flow regime signal in the derivative plot. It provides a better way to define connected volume to the well, and it does not require costly long buildups. So it would be great if we could somehow convert our data into constant rate pressure response. So they did. It's called pressure rate deconvolution, and it all comes from the convolution integral here. And this equation's been around for decades. It's just no one knew how to solve it. So let's quickly go through the equation. So PT is the observed pressure data. That's this data here. That's the data recorded by your downhole gauge. PI is your initial reservoir pressure. That's at this point before any production from the field or from this well. And again, that can be recorded by your downhole pressure gauge, or you could have it from MDT, extrapolated back up to your gauge depth. Q is the measured rate history. That's what we measure at surface. PU, this is the important part of this equation. PU is the unit rate response function, and it is the signature of well and reservoir, and the units for PU are in PSI per stock tank barrel per day. So you can visualize what pressure rate deconvolution does. It tries to convert this data into this data here. And this is the constant rate drawdown. And if you take the derivative of this, you end up with the unit rate response function, and that gives you all those added advantages that I showed you on the previous slide. And just so you understand what the unit rate response function is, it's this top dp curve here. So this is what the equation tries to solve for. And if you take the derivative of that, you end up with a derivative here, which tells you all about the reservoir, and you can decouple all the important properties. But in reality, we have all sorts of problems which results in failure of the deconvolution algorithm. We have gauge noise. You know, our gauges are not perfect. The gauge location, our gauges aren't in the reservoir, unfortunately, they're in the wellbore. And they're also not at the perforations. They could be a good few 100 feet above the perforations. And that allows noise to be read by our gauge, which might not be reservoir effects, such as, you know, the reservoir may be single phase within the reservoir, but once the fluid goes into the wellbore and drops below, say, bubble point, you start having gas coming out. And if you shut in the well at surface, you have wellbore phase segregation, and that can cause distortions read by the pressure gauge, which has got nothing to do with your reservoir. You may also have tidal effects. So you can see some here. What happens is when the pressure buildup reaches a pressure change that's very small, and that small pressure change might be comparable to the sea level rising up and down. And you can see that in your gauge, and we see that quite a lot in the North Sea. So that can cause these sinusoidal behaviors, which the algorithms don't like. You could have errors in your initial pressure. You could have missing pressure data. Rates are so hard to measure, and you can end up with lots of errors in your rate measurements. And I've added in small rate changes just to show you what's going to happen to your deconvolution algorithm. You might have crossflow within the well between layers, and you might have changing skin. So you can see I've added in noise to my synthetic data now, and you can see what that's done to my derivative plot. It's a lot noisier now. So now I want to describe the deconvolution algorithms that have been developed. And the first one I want to talk about is automatic altogether deconvolution. So remember, this is the deconvolution or the convolution integral. And what we're doing is we feed pressures, initial pressures, and rates into the algorithm. Now, the first thing to say is, what pressures are we feeding? Well, altogether deconvolution only uses the buildup pressures, and it uses all the points within the buildup. And what the algorithm is trying to do is solve this equation directly for the unit rate response function. So let me feed this to a deconvolution algorithm, and this is what you get. Here we quite clearly see the end of wellbore storage and radial flow, but beyond that, you know, the algorithm just cannot handle the noise in the data, the errors in the rate, etc. I mean, this algorithm is trying to tell you something, that the derivative shifts upwards, but if you try and do any straight line analysis, no one's going to believe you. They won't believe these results. So to get around this, altogether deconvolution usually fails for a number of reasons: changing wellbore storage, changing skin, and due to the effects mentioned on the previous slides. So to get around this, they came up with automatic condition deconvolution. And it works the same way, except this time you feed the algorithm all the pressure data in one PBU, and you provide very late time pressure data from the previous PBUs, and you expect that things like wellbore phase segregation should be over by then. So you expect to be reading the clean reservoir signal. But that does not mean you can run away from tidal effects, crossflow between layers, etc., or rate measurement problems. So if we run this through the algorithm, we end up with this response. And it's a lot more stable than the previous slide, but you can see, you know, diffusion does not work like this. We should not be seeing bumps up and down, etc. And, you know, where's my unit slope in late time? Is it this, or is it this last point here? And there's a big difference in pore volume between selecting a point there or a point there. And that's due to how a log-log plot works. So condition deconvolution works better than altogether deconvolution, but uses very little data. Condition deconvolution can produce plausible results. However, a PTA model is needed to check the results, which in effect requires convolution. So Levitin identified the disadvantages of automatic pressure rate deconvolution. So we thought, how can I do this in a better way? And he came up with this tool called Convex, Convolution Explorer. And what he's trying to do is manually reconstruct the unit rate response function. So I'm going to show you how you do that on the next slide. But just to go over his tool, it's an interactive analysis tool that relies on PTA. It can be analyzed on oil and gas reservoirs. You can do it on single well or multi-well basis. And it's really the extension of PTA into long-term production analysis. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is understand the geometry of fluid flow, reservoir connectivity, and large-scale heterogeneities. And this may lead to us finding out the reservoir connected volume. And understanding all these things is so important for optimizing our FDPs, etc. So like I said, it can be done on a single well or a multi-well basis. Now, deconvolution is generally accepted for use in exploration and appraisal, but it can also be used in certain development scenarios, such as a single well draining the entire reservoir. An example of this is the Cook field in the North Sea. It could be a compartmentalized field with one well per compartment. It could also be a connected reservoir, which is dynamically divided into separate drainage areas. And an example of this is the Corrib gas field offshore Ireland. And you can also use it on unconventionals with or without PBUs. And like I said, it's a multi-well tool, so it should definitely be used on field startups when possible, but also on long-term production. So let me show you how it works and what's the new way to do deconvolution. So let's start with the convolution integral. Remember, deconvolution, you're solving for PU, but this time we draw PU ourselves manually using special software. And while we draw PU, we interactively solve for PT. So let me show you with this video how it works. Let me just explain what you're looking at first. So here's the convex panel with all the analysis data. Here for well B1, we have the rates in green. We have the recorded pressure data in blue. I'll come back to this red line. Here in blue with the noisy data, we have the buildup of the derivative of this buildup in superposition time. And all that's there for is a guide to help me draw my unit rate response function. Now remember, this is the unit rate response function here, and this is the derivative. So if we feed this unit rate response function here into this equation, and we solve for PT, this is the result. So here, this looks like infinite acting radial flow, and this is obviously not the case for this reservoir. There's much more depletion going on. So let's start the video, and you can see how we do deconvolution manually. So we draw the derivative over the derivative of this PBU. We set the level of skin, and now you can see there's still not enough depletion in the system, so we end up moving the control points up the way. And that's going to cause depletion in the system. And you can see we're interactively solving against the downhole pressure data. And a few things to note here is we're using all the pressure data, not just PBUs, but we're using flowing pressures. So you can see what I'm doing here is I am anchoring two control points to the pore volume line, and I'm creating the reservoir smaller and smaller. You see the pore volume over here decreasing, and that's what it does to my pressure match. And you can see I've made it too small with 59 million reservoir barrels. So here I set it at 78 million reservoir barrels, and you can see there's still a bit of a mismatch. Remember, this is pore volume in reservoir barrels, not stock tank oil initially in place. So here I set my radial flow regime. I calculate a permeability of 484 with this noisy data. Remember, the true answer is 500 millidarcies. My geologist tells me I'm within a channel, and my derivative in superposition time shows an upturn. So I place my half slope there, and I can anchor my point to the half slope. And you can see our match is getting better and better, but we can still see that the connected volume is just a bit too high. So what we need to do is make the connected volume a bit smaller, but we need to be super precise, so we just change it by small values here. And we end up with 72 million reservoir barrels. And if you can convert that to stock tank oil initially in place, it comes out at about 34 million stock tank barrels, what I showed you previously. So now you can see we've drawn a smooth response that is true to diffusion, and is true to the Boris field. So we've done a much better job than the deconvolution algorithms when we're dealing with noisy data, because overall we're looking at the big picture, whereas automatic pressure rate deconvolution focuses on very small parts of the data. And this is the disadvantage of automatic pressure rate deconvolution. But you can see we can get around this by doing things manually and comparing it to 3,300 hours of data. So this is a robust technique to handle difficult data to solve the pressure rate deconvolution problem. But what about multi-well problems? So now I'm on to talking about multi-well deconvolution, and I've added in another well B2, shown in pink. We have B1 and we have B2. B1 is in green, B2 is in pink. I added in a variable flow rate history for well B2 in pink, as seen here, and this is their pressure response. And I'm accounting for interference here. And to prove that these wells are in interference, you can see that I kept well B2 shut in for a long time while B1 in green was producing. And if you look at the downhole pressure gauge of B2, you can see that the pressure at B2 starts to decline due to production at B1. So what are we trying to achieve with multi-well deconvolution? Well, the first step of multi-well deconvolution is we need to remove the interference effects between these two wells. So the first step is to remove it. So we would want to see data like this. So you can see now that the pressure at B2 no longer declines due to production at B1. So that's the first step of multi-well deconvolution, is to remove the interference. So this is without interference and this is with interference. The second step of multi-well deconvolution is to remove the variable rate history into constant rate history, as shown. Why do we want to do this? Well, if you take the derivative of this, you end up with this. And this provides a lot of insights into the field. So let's analyze this channel reservoir. Well, we find that the reservoir is extremely homogeneous. Both derivatives end at the same pressure level, and we can say that there's a lot of homogeneous reservoir properties between the two wells and the channel. We find that the skin in well B2 is higher, and that could be due to maybe a different completion, or maybe our perforation job wasn't done as well as in B1. We also find that well B2 is much closer to reservoir restrictions. And then we trace out the reservoir from the point of view, and ultimately both wells see the field connected volume in late time. So both wells are connected to the entire channel. And that's very useful to know, because if B1 goes offline, or we lose B1, we do know we still have access to all the oil in place through well B2. We may or may not decide to replace B1, but it's good to know that we are connected. So multi-well deconvolution attempts to remove the effects of interference between producing wells. This allows us to see the reservoir from the point of view of each well in isolation, allowing us to decouple all reservoir properties. So let's talk about how we account for interference in multi-well deconvolution. So here's my channel reservoir. What I'm looking for is a B1 self-response. I'm looking for a B2 self-response, and we're going to end up with an interference response between the wells. So we end up with 3 responses, and this is due to the principle of reciprocity. You might think, why don't I have an interference response, 2 interference responses? But what we assume is the interference from B1 to B2 is equal to the interference response from B2 to B1. So I've set up Convex again, and let's just go through what you're looking at so it's clear. So this is well B1. In blue is the downhole pressure gauge data. And for B2, again, in blue is the downhole pressure gauge data. We have the rates for B2 here, and not shown below is the rates for B1. So these are the responses. So I've set up the correct self-responses for B1 and B2. This is just for demonstration purposes. So B2 is in green and B1 is in black. This blue derivative here is the B2 derivative in superposition time, and in pink is the B1 derivative in superposition time, but they're just used as a reference and a guide, so just ignore them for now. In red, this is the interference response, and right now it's at a level where there's no interference between the two wells. And to prove that, if you just look over here, remember when B2 is shut in, the results of these 3 curves would end up in this pressure response here, and you can see that there's no pressure drop to interference. So again, let's start the video. So there's a few things you should know about interference responses. And that is when the reservoir reaches pseudo-steady state, all responses end up on the same unit slope in late time. And that's because when you're in pseudo-steady state, the pressure at every point within the reservoir declines at the same rate. Another thing to tell you about interference responses is they are delayed in time. And the delay depends on the distance between the wells and the reservoir properties between the wells. And another thing to let you know is that they are monotonic responses, and that means they're always increasing as shown. So what we do is, for Convex to get the pressure match, we zoom in on the period of time when one well was shut in for a long time, and that just helps us draw our interference response. So if we just watch the video, you can see that small little tweaks and how that results in our convolution pressure match. So you can see here for B1, it looks like a good match, but for B2 with this response, there's a tiny mismatch in pressure here. And that's dependent on this part of the interference response. And what we can say is about a strong arrival signal in this case is about 300 hours. And that's when the interference response becomes on par with the self-responses for the other wells. So here you would see a strong signal. And if we zoom out, we can see now we have a good pressure match for B1, for B2. We have two self-responses that make sense according to the map. Remember, B2 sees faults before B1 because it's much closer. So you see the derivative for B2 shift up before. And ultimately, we get the connected volume in this reservoir. So this is the end result, like I just showed you on the previous slide. So let's just summarize some of those points. Interference signals are monotonic. As shown, it's always increasing. After a certain amount of time, interference signals become comparable to the pressure effects of the well's own production. In this case, that's about 200 to 300 hours. This response is comparable to this response for the pressure level. And again, that's due to distance and reservoir properties between wells. If the reservoir reaches pseudo-steady state, all lines converge on a late time unit slope. During pseudo-steady state, the pressure at any point within the reservoir declines at the same rate. Now, something in general to say about multi-well deconvolution is that the number of responses begin to escalate as the number of wells increases. So for a 2-well problem, you see I have 3 responses. But for a 5-well problem, you'd end up having 15 responses. And that would be 5 self-responses for the 5 wells, plus 10 interference responses. So you can see that this can become a very tricky process. The next thing to ask is, can we validate these results? I know I've drawn this by hand, but I used the build-up derivatives to help guide the initial part, and then for the late part of this responses, I used the full 3,600 hours of data. But is there another way we can validate all this? And the answer is yes. Levitan came up with a 2D semi-analytical simulator. So what you do is you take your field map. Now, I know my field map is a box, so just bear with me for now. But you draw your polygon around your field map. You add your wells. You add the properties of the polygon based on what you saw from radial flow, from your logs, etc. And you run the simulator. So in black is the 2D simulator's response, here for B1, here for B2, and here for the interference signal. And the blue dots is what I did by hand on the previous slides. So you can see I have a very good self-response match for B1, I have a good match for B2. And for the interference response, you see I have a good match here, but not so much here. But remember, this interference response at this time has barely any effects. It's this late time response that has the big impact on our ability to match the pressure signals in these wells. So like I said, I'm showing it you for a box, but we're trying to get away from PTA analytical boxes. So here's a real reservoir channel, and we did some analysis for this. And you can see that we drew the 2D simulator polygon all around the channel. This field had a few wells in it. I can't show you the results, but I can make some statements about this. So based on the analysis of this field, OPC deduced that the connected volume is greater than that on the map. So you see that we had to draw our polygons further out than what the map was showing. And this helped the client reevaluate their FTP and in particularly injection planning. You know, the pore volume in this field is actually a lot more than they initially thought, and that means their pressure is not going to decline as fast as they originally thought. So some comments about the simulator. You know, the simulator is incredibly fast to set up. It does not have the computational penalty effects of gridding, and it gives high quality pressure transient results without gridding effects. So here's another field. This field can be found in SPE 195904, and OPC did analysis. Again, we drew our polygons. So this time we have 5 different polygons with different properties. The polygons interact with each other. And yeah, each polygon has their own properties, e.g. KH skin, pore volume. The reservoir shape is no longer constrained by 4 straight line boundaries as per classical PTA. The polygons shown add up to the minimum connected volume for this reservoir when we did this analysis. With more production in time, the full reservoir signal may manifest itself in the pressure and rate data. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find out how the reservoir is plumbed together, which helps in optimizing the FTP and identifying any further opportunities for development. So here is a well. This is a real example. This is a well in a field with multiple wells, but what we found was it had a self-response. And what that means is there was no interference. So it seems like this well is connected to sand bodies that are not connected to any other wells. And it was a high productivity dry gas well. The reservoir pressure declined from 6,300 psi to 1,500 psi. And you see we have a good period of short PBUs, and that's going to help guide the early and late time response function when we draw this. And we've also accounted for the rate dependent skin. But you know, this is real data and we had some real problems. You know, we had bad pressure data, you know, what's going on here? The pressure doesn't go down like this normally. We had missing pressure data here. We had rate misallocation errors here. But you can see this response function, it really described the pressure signal quite well. And we have a mismatch here, which is why we questioned the rate. And we found out that this operator did note that they had rate problems during this period of time. So it's great that we got all that results, but can we use these results to help constrain our full field simulation model? And the answer is yes, definitely. So imagine here's my 3D model, and how would I go about history matching this 3D model based on the results of multi-well deconvolution? So I would run B1 only at the unit rate response function and calibrate the model to ensure the ResSim model overlays the derivative of the unit rate response function and the unit rate response function. So what do I mean by that? I add one well, I run it at a constant rate, I get the drawdown response, and I take the derivative. And in pink is my incorrect ResSim model, not history matched yet, and in blue is my is the correct unit rate response function for B1 based on our multi-well deconvolution analysis. And this is what the variable rate history plot that we are used to history matching shows. So let's make comparisons between these. Well, if I look at here, I can see that my permeability is too high, the radial flow is too low down, and my connected volume is too high. Now let's compare what we can say from this plot. Well, we can clearly see that the connected volume is too high, but it doesn't tell us by how much. This plot, if I add my unit slope here, and I compare it to my unit slope here, that's going to tell me the difference in the pore volumes, and that's going to exactly tell me how much I need to decrease the pore volume of the entire field by. Now let's talk about flowing pressures. Why is my flowing pressure too high? Is it because my permeability is too high? Is it because my skin's not high enough? Or are they correct and the only reason it's off is because of the connected pore volume being too high? This does not provide such insights into the reservoir and lets us clearly see why we have mismatches. But this plot does. This is decoupled everything. So we make those changes, you know, we decrease the permeability, we change the distances to fault, we decrease the pore volume, and we end up with our history match. And if you can match this plot, you can match this plot, no problem. So then we go to well B2, we do the same thing, we remove B1 out of it, we add B2, we run it at a constant rate, we take the derivatives, and we make the same comparisons. Here we find that the permeability at B2 is too low. and the distance to faults in the skins is all wrong. But ultimately, the connected volume is correct, and that's because we corrected it when we history matched B1. So then you history match that, then finally, you run the model with a variable rate history with both wells and apply multi-well deconvolution on the ResSim model. So 2 wells, variable rate history, apply multi-well deconvolution, and both your lines should end up on top. So to summarize, constant rate drawdown theory developed but never achieved in the field. Build-up analysis using superposition time as a proxy for constant rate drawdown analysis, but it complicates analysis. Automatic pressure rate deconvolution was developed, but is not robust enough to deal with noisy data. Manual reconstruction of the unit rate response function was developed to deal with noisy data and provide a deep understanding. This was extended to multi-well problems. Then the Convex 2D simulator was created using polygons over the 2D field map to take analytical PTA away from boxes. And unit rate response functions are a smart way to calibrate the full field geological and dynamic simulation model. So how can this be applied in the North Sea? Well, this year, the OGA awarded 115 licenses in the 32nd round, and these were blocks in mature producing areas close to existing infrastructure. These could generally be small fields that were deemed uneconomical in the past and are now being developed as tiebacks to the existing infrastructure with few wells. These may provide ideal conditions for multi-well deconvolution. So I went onto the OGA's website, I found all the approved FDPs since 2016, and these are them. And what you find is most of the FDPs are only like 1 to 3 well developments. I think Culzean was the biggest with 6 wells. So this provides as I said, multi-well deconvolution can become tricky once you have 5 or more wells, but in the North Sea, for example, we've only got 1, 2, 3 well developments, which could provide ideal conditions for multi-well deconvolution. So I guess OPC, PTA, and Convex success stories. We've applied Convex all over the world. We've done it on USA unconventionals. We've used it in the Gulf of Mexico. Levitan's using it in Guyana, the Liza project on behalf of Hess and ExxonMobil. It's been used in the North Sea already. And a good paper to read if you want a real example of multi-well deconvolution is the giant gas field in Israel called Tamar. One of the reasons why Chevron bought Noble Energy. This was a 5-well development. Early on in the field, it behaved as a single-phase reservoir with negligible aquifer pressure support. We determined 2 reservoir subsystems not in pressure communication. We determined the connected volumes to all wells. We identified which wells received edge water drive and which received bottom water drive. And we actually managed to quantify the level of aquifer support to each well. And along with all these insights, we got the traditional things such as KH, skin, distance to faults, etc. So that's my presentation. Thanks for listening. If you want to ask me any questions, you can email me here. And if you want to read any good papers on deconvolution, I recommend reading these ones here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex, for your presentation today. That was great. I do have some questions for you today. One of the first ones here is, if deconvolution is linear, how do you handle gas reservoirs where the PBT changes with pressure? Okay, that's a good question.
So in PTA in general, to handle the viscosity Z factor product, it's well known that we use pseudo pressure. And this is an exact transformation, but that doesn't completely linearize the fluid flow equation. We've also got a total compressibility and viscosity product in there. And Levitan also developed a gas material balance pseudo time, and that comes from Louis Mattar's work. So with these 2 transformations, we linearize the fluid flow equation, and therefore deconvolution can be applied.
Okay, excellent. I've got our question here from the floor, so to speak, from Donald Horsfall. It said he noticed that the slide deck and explanation of the deconvolution model was focused on production wells, where we have the luxury of long-term production and planned extended PBUs from shutdowns, etc. How accurate and reliable is this model when applied to a single well DST appraisal well test, where the well test data will be up to 72 hours and PBU equal to flow period? So can this method speed up field development planning and reduce risk for the future?
Definitely. Deconvolution is generally been accepted for exploration and appraisal wells. We've done hundreds of these using deconvolution. Unfortunately, you're right, with exploration and appraisal, it might only last a few days. So we end up with a derivative response that probably only ends up being 100 hours long, and you may do a PBU for 24 hours. So we're still not seeing all the flow regimes of the signal. We're still limited by how long you actually flow the well for. But what we can say is it's much better to do long drawdown periods and short PBUs, even for the exploration and appraisal well testing, as best as you can. And that provides us with the clean reservoir signal using the unit rate response function instead of derivatives that distort the flow regime signal.
Okay, perfect, thank you very much. Another one here is, can this technique be used on multi-phase reservoirs?
So again, this kind of goes back to the gas PVT. So deconvolution is linear, and once you have multi-phase problems, it's no longer linear. So there's a few things I should say about that. The first thing is, if you do this at field startup, the well is generally in single phase. It might take a few months to reach pseudo steady state. You do your analysis at the start while it's in single phase, you get all these insights, and maybe you don't need to do it anymore, but you get all these insights that help with FDP. Having said that, for example, you might have oil and water problems, but the viscosity of the oil and water might be similar. And therefore, it's not an exact solution, but it can be a good approximation, and you can still do this type of analysis.
Okay, all right, thank you very much for that. I actually don't have any more questions in here at the moment. I do like the fact that you called the wells the Boris B1 and B2 wells. So,
you saw that.
and I have a vision of Boris and bananas with pajamas for some reason, but there we go.
Okay.
And so, so once again, Alex, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, obviously, we're not in person today, so we can't thank you in person, but at some point in the future, we'll meet and have a handshake and a beer maybe at some point. And thanks everybody for coming along today. Once again, it's great to see the support the SPA gets. These have been difficult times, and I think people are, although they're used to kind of getting on with these virtual events, so obviously returning to an in-person is something we can allude to possibly in the maybe the early part of next year, so we have to wait and see. But so once again, thanks to Alex. Check in the SPA website and all our social media sites, Twitter and so on, to see what events are coming next, and hopefully we'll catch you in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you very much, then. See you there, guys.